A beautiful day to you, and it's a pleasure to have you join us on today's paper review. First, we'll start with the Matrix. On the Matrix newspaper, there are so many headlines and stories on the front page of the Matrix newspaper. The lead page of the Matrix newspaper is written, Worry Itakpe Train Services. 8 incidents in 3 years trigger fear and concerns. You get the full story on page 2 of that particular story. Then at the top of the newspaper, TCN AFDB hosts validation workshop for battery energy storage system. You get the full story to continue reading on that page on page 3 of the newspaper. Federal government approves outstanding payment to 1,240 contractors. You continue reading from page 3 of the same newspaper. At the right of the newspaper, Tinubu swears in new power foreign affairs ministers after Adelabo Tuga exit. You get the full story on page 8 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, Ogun State nab 8 foreign nationals over stage abduction, ransom fraud. You get the full story on page 9 of the newspaper. Then on entertainment, Ara Star responds to backlash over Coco London appearance. You get the full story on page 23 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper as well, how Tinubu governors Senate struck historic deal to create state police. You get the full story on page 9 of the newspaper. On sports, drama as Africa's best World Cup referee is reported denied entry to US. You get the full story on page 25 of the newspaper. We move away from that particular newspaper to the Punch. On the Punch newspaper, on the front page, terrorists den 360 freed Borno captives recount starvation and deaths. 360 captives have been freed in Borno, and they recount their experience. They recount how they've been starved and how some of their victims too were also killed in the process. You get the full story on page 2 and page 3 of the newspaper. Then on politics, this is coming from INEC. INEC to deploy over 2,400 beavers, 9,500 staff. You get the full story on page 11 on the newspaper. Ekiti Pool, Ekiti State are asking INEC to deploy over 2,400 beavers and 9,500 staff to Ekiti. You get the full story on page 11 of the newspaper. Still in page 11 of the same newspaper, Uba Akpabio Bamidele to lead APC campaign council. So Uba Senate President Akpabio and Bamidele are to lead APC campaign council. At the left of the newspaper, Oyo abduction, kidnap principal denies bandits Sharia demand. You get the full story on page 3 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper as well, Nigerians spend 50 billion naira on US visa applications. You get the full story on page 9 of the newspaper. Then on South Africa's xenophobic attack, federal government weighs sanction against South Africa. You get the full story on page 7 of the newspaper. Suspected kidnappers killed soldiers, injure another in Ogun. Suspected kidnappers succeeded in killing soldier and also injure another person in Ogun State. You get the full story on page 2 of the newspaper. Then on page 7 of the newspaper, this is coming from the federal government, 53,000 dead, 50 million sick yearly from unsafe food. The World Health Organization are recounting the number of people dead and the number of sick people that they have recorded so far due to unsafe food. Away from that newspaper to the Daily Independent. On the lead page of the Daily Independent, subscribers await value as 3 billion-dollar telecom boost falls short. You get the full story on page 29 of the newspaper. Then at the top of that particular newspaper, Senate to consider bill on state police this week. You get the full story on page 7 of the newspaper. So the Senate, they are considering passing a bill on state police this week. Then on page 6 of the same newspaper, Nigeria can achieve $1 trillion economic with outdated data, coming from Abbas. Abbas says that Nigeria cannot achieve $1 trillion economic with outdated data. You get the full story on page 6 of the newspaper. Then at the left of the newspaper, Tinubu project Lagos as Africa's gateway to global capital. President Bola Ahmed Tinubu has projected Lagos State as Africa's gateway to global capital. You get the full story on page 29 of the same newspaper. Federal government moves repatriation of Nigerians from South Africa to tomorrow. You get the full story on page 7 of the newspaper. Then on page 7 of the newspaper as well, World Bank blames weak governance, inefficiencies for Nigeria's water supply crisis. World Bank are blaming weak governance and inefficiency for Nigeria's water supply crisis. Some of Nigeria's water board are not working, so the World Bank are blaming it on weak government and inefficiency. Still in the same newspaper, federal government okays over 700 billion naira for 1,240 local contractors. You get the full story on page 6 of the newspaper. Labour warns workers may stay home over rising insecurity. You get the full story on page 7 of the newspaper. We'll move away from that newspaper to the New Telegraph. On the New Telegraph, in the front page of the New Telegraph, there are so many stories and headlines on the front page of the newspaper. Then on the lead page of that particular newspaper, xenophobic treatment of Nigerians. Federal government expresses displeasure at South Africa government stance. You get the full story on page 4, 5, and 6. Nigerian governments are expressing their disappointment in the stance of South African government due to the treatment that South Africans are melting out on Nigerians. At the top of that particular newspaper, growing investor confidence boosts bank capital inflow by 62.8% to $21.08 billion. Growing investor confidence boosts banks capital inflow by 62.8% to $21.8 billion. You get the full story on page 4 of that particular newspaper. Then on politics, Peter Obi condemns ethnic profiling, says crime has no ethnicity. You get the full story on page 5 of the newspaper. On the foreign scene, on page 5 of the newspaper as well, Israel-Iran trade strikes threaten to drag region back to full-scale war. Israel and Iran are trading. They are still on their war, and this time they are threatening to drag region back to full-scale war. Still in the same newspaper on page 4 as well, insecurity, NLC, TUC threaten nationwide action. The NLC and the TUC are threatening nationwide action due to insecurity. So you get the full story on page 4 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, on Ayo abduction, school principal debunks Sharia law, ransom demand in new video. You get the full story on page 2, 27, and 29 of the newspaper. We move away from that newspaper to the Guardian. On the Guardian newspaper, still on insecurity, Labour protests as Senate expedites State Police. You get the full story on page 6 of the newspaper. We move away from that newspaper to this day newspaper. On this day newspaper, in the lead page, "I'll not allow violent extremists define identity," Tinubu vows. President Bola Ahmed Tinubu says that he will not allow violent extremists to define our identity. You continue reading on page 8 of the newspaper. Then at the top of the newspaper, external reserves hit 17-year high of $50.12 billion, grow 30.9 YOY, 30.9% YOY. External reserves hit 17-year high of $50.12 billion, growth 30.9% YOY. You continue reading on page 8 of the newspaper. We move away from that newspaper to the blueprint. On the blueprint newspaper, still on xenophobic attacks. This particular headlines is surfacing in almost all the papers today. Tinubu orders evacuation of Nigerians from South Africa. Finally, President Bola Ahmed Tinubu has ordered for the evacuation of all Nigerians from South Africa. Get the full story on page 8 of the newspaper. We move away from that newspaper to the Daily Sun. On the Daily Sun newspaper, Tinubu calls for whistle blowing against terrorists. President Bola Ahmed Tinubu has called for whistle blowing against terrorists. And the follow-up stories there says urges Nigerians to say something and also say something. Senate to pass state police bill this week. So the Senate are set to pass state police bill this week. And President Bola Ahmed says that if you say something, you say something. This is not a time for everyone to remain silent on the issue of insecurity. So you get the full story on page 6 of the newspaper. Then at the top of that particular newspaper, on Biafra, Gowon under fire over account of civil war. Gowon under fire over account of civil war. You know, the Biafra issue. Then the follow-up story says accused keeping mum on genocide against Igbo. You get the full story on page 27 of the newspaper. Then on page 6 of the newspaper as well, Ijo Urobo, stakeholders write INEC demand urgent implementation of Warri delineation. You get the full story on page 6 of the newspaper. We've come to the end of the newspaper review. Many thanks for watching and do have a beautiful day.